Here we are, another interview by the OCBS, but this time not with a student of Buddhist studies, but with somebody very different and who's working on quite a different project. So why don't we start off by you introducing yourself, Michael, and then we'll get right into the project that you're working on.
Okay. Hi, I'm Michael Kicey. I am Humanities Liaison Librarian at State University of New York in Buffalo, New York, in the United States. I've been in my position now for about 2.5 years. As part of my work as Humanities Librarian, I'm librarian for a number of different departments, including classics, comparative literature, history, mathematics, and philosophy. And as part of my work for those departments, and also sort of independently on my own as a librarian, one of the things that I and other librarians are expected to do is to put together what are essentially websites. We call them research guides, but they work just like any other website. They're called research guides, and use a licensed software provided by a company called SpringShare. They provide a suite of online modules, sort of online software that librarians use for a number of different purposes. And part of that suite is called LibGuides. And LibGuides have been around for a while. I think it started to sort of blow up in the library world around like 2004, 2005, and they're talked about in 2006. And essentially what it is it's based in Bootstrap, which is kind of an add-on module that uses HTML, CSS in a way that's convenient for web design. It uses Bootstrap, but it's sort of a modular, very easy to use web design framework. And what you do with it is you build online resources that are appropriate for guiding students and faculty and other patrons into doing library research. Usually when LibGuides are put together, they're put together in a subject area. So for instance, I have guides that are in mathematics and philosophy, sort of basic, broad research guides in big disciplinary areas. But one of the other uses that LibGuides can be put to is to focus on a specific subject or topic. And nowadays, I think librarians kind of, everyone creates LibGuides, everybody puts a little bit of time into them at least. They're kind of regarded as a necessary evil in our jobs. But I realized when I was learning LibGuides that they had a lot of capacity that a lot of LibGuides I've seen do not take advantage of at all, in terms of an easy web design that communicates clearly and gets a lot of content to people very quickly. More specific in the context of the guide to Buddhism, I became interested in Buddhism around this time last year. I've been reading it fairly seriously for only about a year now. Because I was auditing a course here with a friend of mine who teaches in the philosophy department. He teaches sort of a kind of an undergrad survey course in Eastern philosophy. And I was interested in sitting in and doing some of the readings because I knew absolutely nothing about these traditions. So I sat in on his class, and at one point we read the Dhammapada, and I became extremely interested in that text, and also just sort of in early Buddhist scriptures, early Buddhism, and Buddhism in general. And so, being a librarian, being a professional researcher, I just started to sort of build a list of books that I'd like to read in the future, and things that were sort of at my level and slightly beyond. And pretty soon, when I started to sort of build this list, I immediately sort of clicked over into librarian mode, because I created guides like this for other topics in the past, where I had accumulated a great deal of bibliography, and I thought, well, why not share this with other people? Yeah. When I started to do this with Buddhism, I said, this already has the makings of a LibGuide. So I basically used the LibGuide structure to create a bibliography for myself, but also with a view to publishing it online and sharing it with other people. The first edition of the guide, the first version of it, I put on the web. I published it, I think it was in May 2019. And it was good. I was happy with what I put together, but there were a number of areas where I knew there was a great deal more resources than I was able to find immediately and put on the guide. So I continued to sort of work on it in the background. I took the guide actually down for a couple months because of the way editing works. I had to sort of take it offline in order to sort of reconstruct parts of it. And then in I think it's the beginning of December. I think it was like December 4th or sometime around there, 2019, last year. I put out the second edition of this guide. And this is much fuller than the version of the guide. For instance, on the first guide, the section on Zen was a single book gallery. It was a very full gallery, but it was just one gallery of books. And now on the second edition of the guide, the section on Zen is an entire tab on the site with 5 subpages, and all of those have subordinate galleries too. So it's much bigger this time. And basically what I started doing when I originally constructed the guide, I did, kind of the traditional work of bibliography, which is to say I would find recent works, I would look in the bibliographies, find those works, look in their bibliographies, and continue to sort of build in a very traditional way through citation chaining an authoritative list. What I did with the second edition was I identified, by visiting a whole bunch of publishers' websites, many dozens of websites, I determined which publishers were the most important for Buddhist studies. And I basically just found their pages where they said, okay, here are our books on Buddhism. And I imported all of those titles then into the guide. So the second edition of the guide is very copious. It's not necessarily things I found in bibliographies, it's just what I found on the web. Another thing I did too, although this like, just because of the way this works, is blew up into an enormous territory I can't possibly hope to cover, is that I started to use, I identified certain titles that I thought would be good starting points for this. And I looked them up in Amazon, and I used Amazon's data. When you look at an Amazon product and it says, other customers looked at these items or other customers purchased these items, I used that to sort of build out and to chain a network of resources. I would look up a scholarly book, and then you would find another 10 or 15 scholarly books in Amazon's data, and I would bookmark those and then do the same thing. So it was like citation chaining, but I did it through Amazon. So anyway, at the moment, I'm still adding things much more gradually and a little bit more slowly than I have over the past couple months. But I've tried to find ways to sort of build resources by branching out that way, either online or through print resources from what I already have. But I hopes for the guide. I don't want to promote myself too much, but I do want to say that it's very unusual for guides of this kind to get a lot of web traffic from outside the institutions where they're based. For instance, a guide at University of Buffalo, for instance, would be built to serve specifically Buffalo departments for a specific topic or area that researchers or students are working on a lot here at this institution. And they're typically used by people affiliated with the institutions where they're hosted. What's peculiar about this guide, and I can see through the analytics dashboard that we have access to through SpringShare, there's a lot of web traffic actually coming to this guide from outside UB, from Google, Facebook. It's been shared on Facebook, even though I've made no effort to share it on Facebook. It's been shared on Facebook. It's been shared on Twitter. My friend Nick Bomarito, who I mentioned before, also shared it on Twitter and sort of got it circulating in social media. And University Libraries has also shared it as well. So it's being found by people. And also I can see where it has come from. People have been viewing it from all over the world. It's been viewed from like Croatia, Hong Kong, Japan, the Netherlands, all sorts of places. And it's within basically about less than 2 months now since it's re-released, it's gotten almost 3,000 hits, which in web terms doesn't sound like very much, but for like a research guide of this kind, based in a library, it's pretty substantial. Future of it, I want to keep building it. I want to get sort of more deeply entrenched in Buddhist studies and visit conferences and promote the guide and talk to scholars more about what they'd like to see me do with it. But I'd like to maintain it as long as possible and keep it updated and keep it responsive to what people need.
Yeah, wow, that's really great. I think after hearing all this, our viewers will want to see what you have been talking about. So I'll just go right into the website. So this is it, right? So that's the URL where you can find it. And so it's the second edition now, as you have said, of the research guide. And how now would you sort of expect, or how do you see people to actually use it? So let's say I'm interested in Theravada, right? And then I have subsections here. Though I have subsection main, primary text, early in Indian Buddhism, Southeast Asia, teachers and teachings. So let's say I click on main, and then so what do I have here? That's sort of general information about Theravada, or?
Yeah, the main page for Theravada is somewhat minimal. There's a book gallery down below. If you scroll down a bit further, these are books that are about Theravada Buddhism in general. there's many more books. The literature in Theravada Buddhism, and I had to make all sorts of very difficult and weird decisions about how to split things up, how to categorize things. There's very many books that I had to list in more than one place just because of how topics broke down. But here, for instance, are just books that are about Theravada Buddhism in general. So you're looking at sort of a transnational context or sometimes sort of a broad historical context.
Yeah.
The other options under the tab that you drop down there where there's an option to look at Theravada Buddhism in Southeast Asia. There you get more sort of nation-centric literature. So for instance, Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, I think also in Cambodia and Laos, so they get a little more fine-grained there. But there are, for each of those main tabs on the page, there's sort of, a main overview page for Theravada Buddhism, for Tibetan Buddhism, for Zen, and so on, that have sort of broader works, and then it gets more fine-grained in the subpages. But because, as you know, Buddhism died out in India at a certain point, but nonetheless, the Indian tradition had an enormous influence on how Theravada Buddhism was shaped and how it turned out. I included early in Indian Buddhism under the Theravada tab, just figuring that people would be interested, but that's a closely related domain. But again, like I said, I would love to hear feedback from anyone watching this video about how I might categorize things better, or how I might restructure the guide in future to reflect the historical reality of Buddhist culture and thought, and also the way that scholars would be approaching these resources. Like I said, make difficult calls on my own.
Of course, yeah. So for example, these kind of sections, so where does this text come from? So that is sort of fed automatically into your website by then, for example, Amazon, that you also use for other purposes, or where does it come from?
So I was flattered because I showed a lot of people this guide and they said, did you read all these books and then write paragraphs about them? I said, no. So when it's called mounting an asset. When I import a book to the guide, there's a great deal of information that gets automatically populated from servers information on servers provided to us by SpringShare, by the people who license the software. And part of that, when you download that information for a specific book title into the guide, is basically a publisher's blurb, which is usually very close to, if not identical, with what you would see as back jacket copy if you were holding a print copy of the book and reading the back of it. Recent books, back jacket copy, especially academic books, is fairly long and extensive. For stuff in the popular press and older items, it tends to be a little shorter. But these, the informative text that I included with the featured titles in underneath the galleries there is mostly, I edited it slightly sometimes for space and for content, but for the most part, that represents what you would read on the back of the book, or what you would read if you went to the publisher's website and wanted to read about the book.
Yeah, I see. And those links to the books, they don't lead to the publisher websites, right? But instead they're leading to WorldCat. So the place to be for librarians, pretty much.
Yeah, well, not just for librarians. This was a decision I made for the second edition of the guide. The first edition, I should have mentioned this before. The first edition of the guide was still kind of rooted in kind of the traditional context of serving the institutional context that I exist was UB. As a result, all the links to books and resources on that guide were centered on UB resources, stuff that we have here in our library collections. I heard from people who had been using the guide, and I talked to scholars a little bit, and I did some more thinking about who the guide was intended for, who its real audience was meant to be, and if it was going to have an interesting future, how I could structure it to make it more useful. Another decision I made was to replace the links on the guide to records in our catalog, UB's catalog, to links to WorldCat, which is it's called a union catalog, a worldwide union catalog of many thousands of libraries have sort of integrated their catalog so that they're all uniformly searchable through WorldCat. So the rationale there was that if you click through these links, or if you do any kind of search on WorldCat, the catalog records that you find, and you have an example of that in front of you, you can actually, in the box that's sort of at the top of the screen now, if you scroll up a little bit, no matter where you are in the world, you can enter your postal code. Now it's sort of geared towards what you're looking at the German version of the site, so it's a German postal code. But you can enter your local postal code, whatever country and it will tell you the most the proximate, the nearest libraries that hold either print or electronic copies of the book in question. So I envision this as a way to give the whole guide is meant to sort of give a front-facing and attractive and meaningful and substantial front to WorldCat's data, which can link people to library resources in their local neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Much more than just sort of linking it to just Buffalo. In this way, it becomes a much more global resource.
Yeah, of course, because you're sort of expecting, or I guess you're maybe even seeing or getting sort of the feedback that tells you, okay, your guide is mostly used by actually, for example, then Buddhist studies scholars, right? Or Buddhist studies students who are using it for their research and for their studies. And so it makes sense for them to be able to know, okay, in which library can I actually find the book? Because they're probably enrolled in some university and can thus sort of actually loan the book there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see. And for example, because as you've said, so you're always thinking about how to change this, how to improve it, etc. So did you think about, for example, in some way, including information regarding, for example, the reviews that books get? It can be either reviews they receive on Amazon, or, for example, then if you're sort of more focused on academia, to have, for example, links going to then literature reviews, right? Because most of these books by now will have had several even people to review them in some journals, and you could sort of add that information here. It depends pretty much on the workload connected to that, right? So the question would be how to do it for you technically so that you don't actually have to do it manually yourself for each and every book. But yeah, I guess you thought about that already, right?
That's an interesting idea. That would be a colossal amount of data because the guide already contains somewhere in the neighborhood. I've done a rough estimate. I think conservatively, I can say I don't know what the exact number is, but it contains about 2,500 to 3,500 books. A lot of them appear in multiple places, and the cross references are not necessarily immediately evident. So there is a lot of content on this guide. Secondly, it would be, there's the question of, since most of these are academic books, they would be reviewed, in the context of an academic book review. There would be issues with linking to book reviews that are copyrighted. If I found a reliable source for, say, reviews of these books on the internet, like Amazon or Goodreads, there would probably be quite a bit of tech know-how necessary for me to actually establish a feed for each book. However, I mean, it is a good idea because then you would get multiple perspectives on each resource. That's a good idea. I'll keep it in mind. I'll think about incorporating more sort of perspectives on each book. I don't know if it's something I can do for every single book on the guide, but that's worth thinking about, I think.
Yeah, of course. It really comes down to how to actually sort of implement this, and if there would be a way for you to feed already existing data into this. Because, for example, what I've seen, I think it was Routledge where I've seen that where they have on their own website where they present their books, right? They often have links to reviews. But I'm not sure if it was that publisher, but I've seen it on some website. But it makes sense for them to also sort of at least to link to the good reviews, right? Use the sort of favorable reviews. And one could think about ways of how that could be sort of fed into this. And if that doesn't sort of work, that's technically too difficult. Maybe because that is only you, right? Only you are working on all this.
Yeah.
So
this is entirely me. This is not a team thing. I put this whole thing together myself.
Yeah, and there are no sort of extra resources, I assume, that were given by Buffalo University to you to do this, right?
No.
So this is pretty much
this was part of my regular work. Yeah.
Of your regular work. Yeah. So I think obviously if there's no way for them to sort of change that and to allow you to work more intensely on this yourself, then another way I think would be to think about how can this maybe become a sort of a joint effort. And for example, because that is sort of in everybody's mouth nowadays, sort of crowdfunding, etc., right? And sort of crowd implementation in a sense, to have, for example, people tell you, okay, there exist these 2 or 3 or 4 reviews of that book, right? And sort of add information to you, to send it to you somehow in a sort of easily made manner. That I guess it would have to be connected to the website as well, so that, for example, when I'm here, I could tell you by clicking on some link or something, I can just post in links or whatever it would be to those reviews, right? So that is easy for me to do, and that it's easy for you to sort of receive the information, and thereby you would sort of use the Buddhist studies crowd in a sense to help you build up this resource and not having to do it all yourself. So there are a number of ways how one could sort of approach this, but yeah, it really comes down to what is possible for you, what is possible from a technical perspective, and what are the resources that are dedicated to this, right?
Yeah, I think that makes a great deal of sense. I think if such an external source did exist, and I had the help of many people looking at the guide, I think it would be actually fairly straightforward to link those external sources then from within the guide. The other issue for me, just sort of a basic web design issue, is you can always add more content to these things. But one consideration that I always had as I was putting together the guide was that people are accustomed to, and to a certain sense, that in a certain sense they're justified in not getting totally overloaded with a single web page. Because you can put so much on a single web page, it can just go on and on and on. And I realized as I was working at some of these pages, part of the rationale for splitting up into separate pages was just the load on attention, right? I can always add more. I can always make it richer and more complex. But I was aware of the fact that someone looking at one of these pages may very quickly just get bogged down and exhausted by the sheer quantity of stuff that they're looking at. That linking to external content in the way that you're suggesting also gives the user the opportunity to sort of reduce that load somewhat and make recourse to that information if and when they need it. Because if I think part of the reason for the success of the guide is not just that it's visually attractive and it's clearly laid out, but it presents already a great deal of material. There's a great deal of reading you can do on these pages, but that it doesn't necessarily throw everything at once in the user's face. So that's another consideration, but I think the feature that you suggest is a really great idea.
Yeah, of course, because nowadays sort of the problem or the issue that one has to deal with is not access to information. As long as you have internet access, right, you have pretty much the world's knowledge at your fingertips. But really, it comes down to curation, right? Somebody to be there for you. So that if I Google Buddhism, I'll get millions of hits, right? And that is not the problem, that I don't find enough information on Buddhism or Buddhist studies literature. But what I need, sort of as a student or even as a researcher, is somebody to curate that information for me, right? So that somebody who knows who has the expertise, who knows the stuff, for that person to sort of tell me, okay, what is relevant here, what isn't relevant, and what should I look at, what shouldn't I look at, and which book is good, which book isn't that good, etc. But then, of course, you get into the subjectivity of those methods, right? So one researcher may think, well, this book is sort of the book to read, and then another one would say, well, no, I don't think so. It would be that book, but would be my book and not yours, and etc. And because I published this book, that is the best one, etc. And obviously, you as a librarian, you also don't want to sort of make enemies with any publishers, right? So if you would start to sort of actually rank the books, right? So if you read one, if you can only read one introduction to Buddhism, it would be that one, right? The top one, and then maybe the second one and the third one. And if then a publisher would see, well, why are we ranked fourth or whatever, they might get mad at you, right? So it's quite difficult. There are a number of sort of difficulties involved in this, but for it to be sort of ever more useful for the community, I think you already have sort of done a great deal of work here, and very valuable resource just by amassing it all in one place that looks good, right? And that is not trying to sell me. Because obviously I can also just type in Buddhism on Amazon, right? And then I will get sort of the first 3 results are probably ads, right? So the publisher paid for them to appear there. hoping for more clicks. And then further down below, Amazon sort of will have their own machine learning system recommending me specific stuff based on what they think I will probably buy, etc. Right? And what you have done is sort of that it is not, the website is not trying to sell me, right? And it's also not even, as you've said, the second edition is not even linking to the publisher's website, but to the website of WorldCat, where I can see libraries having it. So there's no sort of you trying to sell those books, the publishers trying to get their books on your guide so that more people will buy it, because through your guide, nobody is directly going to buy it.
These were all really important principles to me. I mean, what you said before about curation, first of all, I mean, I think increasingly the problem that people in the information professions and also in scholarship are going to be facing over probably the next 20, 30 years is exactly what you're saying, is that access, there are manifold problems still with access. And, we can talk about, the fact that the internet is not worldwide. There are many places in the world where no one has internet. But that at least, in the developed West and in many developed countries all over the place, internet is increasingly ubiquitous. And the problem is no longer, punching in Buddhism and Google and getting results, but the problem is actually is too much and not the right kind and not good enough information. And the opposite problem, the strange new problem that we're going to be encountering, if we're not encountering it already, is that people will have access to absolutely no shortage of information, but that they may actually be turned off and discouraged from learning more because of the sheer mass of things that they have to evaluate before they can even begin to learn. And that people may be sort of, like it's like eating too much junk food. Like you're not hungry anymore, but you haven't been nourished, right? It's increasingly a problem that I designed the guide with that in mind. Like I was saying before, don't throw too much content at people, even though there is a great deal already, and also try to shape that content in a meaningful way so that people have at least a chance of building an integrated experience and an integrated knowledge instead of just a bunch of disparate things that they throw into their head. The second thing that you mentioned that I wanted to address was that I learned a lot actually from looking at Amazon, and you're totally right that the guide is structured not to sell anybody anything, right? And it's actually, I mean, it's an important value to me that the guide remains free and open to everyone on the internet. There are proprietary resources that do bibliographical work that is parallel to what the guide does, but you have to pay a great deal for them. And many college and university libraries do pay for these resources, and they're put together by really smart people with a lot more experience and expertise than me in Buddhist studies, but they're very expensive and they're not available to everyone. And it's proprietary information that goes to people who can use it, but to a very small community of the people who can use it. What I learned from looking at Amazon, not just using Amazon's information, but understanding how Amazon and other places on the internet lay out products, right, like books as commodities, is that I could appropriate a certain amount of that vocabulary. For instance, like the book galleries in the guide are laid out very much like parts of Amazon's sites are for right, for looking at products. I appropriated that, even though it's a built-in feature of LibGuides. I appropriated that because it's something people are used to looking at. Like they will see that particular kind of design module on the internet. They know how to interact with it, and it has a certain appeal, right? It's like looking at it on a shelf in a store. But the difference there is, again, that I'm not selling anybody anything, and that I'm directing people to use their libraries. So it takes some of the visual logic and the information logic of basically online stores and online consumption, and it pushes it over, it appropriates it for the purpose of libraries, which are not about, at least from the user's end, it's not about owning anything, it's about coming into contact with information. That was something that I was happy to do on the guide, even though in certain respects it looks like Amazon, and people might criticize it for saying it's perhaps a little too glossy or it's too commodified looking. Learning from Amazon to do something that I think is distinct from what Amazon or other online retail establishments do, and something that to a certain extent actually resists it, because it's not buying, it's not owning, it's not selling, it's instead sharing.
Of course, it makes a great deal of sense to me that you, on the one hand, it's an ingenious idea to look at the people also bought section, and to just use, because Amazon obviously is one of the top
companies. They have tremendous data.
Worldwide,
they have so much data
when it comes to machine learning, right? And so why would you try to sort of do it on your own? Because obviously that machine learning system trained by millions of people who are using Amazon every day will just be probably the best one for this purpose, right? So looking at that makes just a huge lot of sense, right? And also, as you've said, to look at, because obviously Amazon has just as many resources to put into user experience design, right? So their website looks the way it looks because that is how people want to use it, right? And because they're constantly trying with their focus as a company on the user and the user above everything, and user experience and user sort of journey, etc. That's one of the core values of their company. Their website is easy to navigate and makes sense for the purpose that it's trying to fulfill, right? People want to find the stuff that they're looking for to then buy it. So it makes a lot of sense to just look at, okay, what did they do here so that people can find the books they're looking for, right? And then you just sort of implemented similar features on your page, and without then sort of setting, as you have said, but just taking in information regarding user experience design, right? So because it is only you, so you have to sort of look for ways to take shortcuts and to sort of not having to try it out on your own, right? But use that Amazon has their website up for more than a decade now, right? And they have made sort of enough experience for all of us to sort of gain from, and not having to make the same mistakes. So I think it's a very refreshing way to approach this, but it makes a lot of sense when it comes to creating websites.
I mean, it's a very small way in which, you know, all this data that is being gathered about us every day. When you take a slightly different viewpoint on like an Amazon product page, and you say, okay, well, you know, Amazon is showing me all these other products I might be interested in because it wants me to spend more money, right? If you look at it from the perspective of a web designer or someone who's producing a guide like I am, you say, no, wait a minute, actually, I can use this for a different aim, right? I can use it for a totally distinct end that actually kind of resists the pull of Amazon and the pull of commodification in a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes made a lot of sense for you to do it this way. So are you now sort of constantly still sort of working on it, or is that something that you return to every 2 or 3 months, or when you get, do you get any, for the second, do you get any feedback? Actually, people sort of contacting you and telling you, okay, I like this, I didn't like that, etc. How does that work?
Yeah, so basically, since I posted the second edition, I also, I mean, the way that you got to know about it was I did some postings on Buddhism, which is part of HNet. As a result of those postings, I have heard directly from, and I've been, you know, really flattered and fortunate to hear directly from a number of really respected Buddhist studies scholars who have told me that this is a really important research tool and a really important resource for the whole discipline. And then a few of them have been kind enough to actually write me supporting letters for my tenure package, and which is a tremendous thing, but really going out of their way to show their appreciation for this resource and for the work that I put into it. So yeah, there's been, you know, the feedback has been, especially with the second edition, it's been very open, and it's been fairly continuous since it came out, and people are really delighted with what the guide's been able to do for them. As far as continuing to work on it, yeah, I mean, I you know, this, you know, particular month is a little hectic because our semester is about to start up here again next week. I have tons of different duties that I have to perform, but yeah, I mean, I continue to add to it. And I continue to look for things. I've identified some resources on the internet, like podcasts and some sites that about new books and Buddhist studies that I keep checking to find items that I haven't added to it yet. But you know, I mean, you know, sort of along the lines of what we were talking about before with how much is now accessible and how much is available, I fully recognize that this is an infinite task, because it turns out I wanted to, at a certain point working on this guide, I wanted to include and acknowledge books that are written in the popular press for a popular audience, not just for the sake of being complete, but also because, you know, at some point, if it's not happening already, there may be researchers in Buddhist studies who are interested in studying, like, okay, let's actually read and think about how authors that, you know, in like serious scholarly Buddhist studies circles are dismissed as being like popularizers or you know, some sort of, you know, watered down version of Buddhism, but they sell millions of books, right? Someone may come along someday, if they're not already, and they may exist, but someone may actually say, okay, let's study these writers and see, you know, how they actually contribute to the tradition of Buddhist thought, or, you know, how they are changing it for, say, an American popular audience. So I wanted to include these resources, but very quickly last month, I was in the process of accumulating them, and I was using Amazon's data to do so. And one of the constraints of Amazon's data is it very often wants to push you immediately towards items in the popular press, and it's not too interested in keeping you among academic books. So you have to sort of resist that when you're working with their system. But I very, very quickly found that it is humanly impossible to actually incorporate all of the books in the popular press that are published on Buddhism. It is literally, because I mean, everyone has written a book on meditation. I can't do it. I just can't do it. Thousands, it would drown the academic content. So I had to make this very difficult decision about whether I was going to keep including these books in the popular press. And I decided, well, I mean, the audience of this guide is people who want to read serious scholarly academic sources on Buddhism. If they want to go into that kind of depth and study it in this way, I can't even find all the books that like the Dalai Lama has written, right? I just can't do it. A whole bunch of books by the Dalai Lama on the guide, but I can't promise to be exhaustive in those areas and in that vein, because there's simply too much. So I mean, that's one of the difficult decisions I've had to make in shaping the guide is that some of it is just humanly impossible. The scholarly books, they're more finite. You know, there's a definite number of them that come out each year, and I can keep on top of those. But you know, some of it remains beyond me. If somebody else wants to make that guide, more power to you. But it is beyond my power.
No, of course, I thought so when because it's called a research guide, right? And it is sort of for academic research. And I think you made the right call by sort of saying, okay, I'll exclude those books. You made it sort of based on the time constraints, right? But I think considering the audience and sort of who wants to use it and who's already using it, I think it's correct to say, okay, we'll go with sort of academic books, even though, of course, these sort of lines are blurry. But I think it makes sense for you to sort of to do that, constrict it in that way. And it will lose sort of its purpose and its usefulness pretty much if it gets too much. Right? I wouldn't need a guide that, for example, is just a copy of Amazon. Right? So because I can just go on Amazon. If I wanted to see all the books on Buddhism, I'll go to Amazon. Right? Or I'll just Google books on Amazon on Buddhism, and I'll get all the results. Right? But what your guide is doing, sort of, it is already for Buddhism. The subsection, those are academic books on Buddhism, right? So if you're interested in Buddhism, there's a lot of it, but this guide is interesting for you and is useful for you if you're interested in actually serious academic work on this subject, right?
Right.
And in that sense, it makes sense to sort of constrict it, because then it's a useful guide, right? Because again, it comes back to the curation, right? What are you doing? You're curating from all the books on Buddhism. You're already creating a filter that only lets through academic books, scholarly books, etc. And that is why it becomes useful, right? And so I think that's definitely correct to do so. And I think one has to see where it goes. And maybe this video will also sort of help gain more viewers and more bigger audience to your resource. And
that would be great.
More
I hope
academics
so.
as well who are going to sort of provide feedback. And as I've said, I think one of the promising possible developments would be to sort of open this up and for it to become more of a joint effort within Buddhist studies, right? Maybe because most professors are so sort of time constrained already, and some of them may even feel too fancy for doing something like this. But for example, graduate and postgraduate students who are still in their MAs and their PhDs or in their early post-PhD careers, they would also be a great resource to tap into for this, right? And
no, I agree. I would really like to see this become, at least on some level, some kind of collaborative project internationally. I think would be great.
Yeah. And so how could people currently, so if one is interested in sort of contacting you about it, etc. So I've seen that on the website you have your email, right? So you have email, and so one could even call you. And then you're also on you have your own.
That's right. Yeah.
Your own page here on your library's sort of website. So again, your email, etc., and then even sort of stuff that you worked on, etc.,
Right.
and publications that you made. And you're on Researchgate, right?
I am indeed. Yes.
Yes, and so you're on a lot of in a lot of places actually. And yeah, it was sort of when I saw it, I was surprised how many of them. And then I found you on Academia.edu.
Yeah, I get around.
Yeah, so you do get around. Yeah, so yeah, where on now you have your sort of your own papers and sort of stuff that you have done in your academic career, right? And last but not least, you're also on LinkedIn. So lots of ways for people to connect with you and to then maybe sort of start working with you on this research guide.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, right now, the feedback that I've gotten has been, it's been from relatively few people, but it's been substantial. I mean, like I was saying, that these scholars wrote, which I was very grateful for. I'm always hoping to get an email from someone who looked at the guide fairly seriously and said, hey, here's like 10 books that you could add that I didn't see that maybe you want to consider putting in, or here's a way that you could maybe structure things a little differently, break up things, or split things in pages or different calories or that kind of thing. That meaningful for scholars. I always welcome that kind of feedback because I have to work entirely like on my own judgment and my own decisions when I do these things. But anyway, if anybody wants to get in contact with me and give me feedback on the guide, I'm eager to hear it.
Great. Well, then I'll hope that this interview will contribute to that. And
I hope so too.
Yeah, in general, thank you for creating this resource for all of us and for sharing it online and only really based on sort of your sole work. So thank you for that. And yeah, we'll look forward to seeing it develop in whichever way it will in the future. It's an exciting resource and exciting development for Buddhist studies.
Well, thank you. Thanks everyone for watching.